Thank you, Bill, for that very kind introduction and for inviting me. No pressure after this big lapse in invited lecturers. So for some reason, I've chosen a really niche and depressing topic to talk about today. So my apologies for that. My apologies to the squeamish. This is the worst image in the presentation, I promise you. I hope, despite its weirdness and nicheness, it will actually have some relevance to things that people are talking about at this conference, and I can actually see some synergies. So yes, I'm going to be talking about down python's throats we thrust live goats, snakes, zoos and animal welfare in 19th century Britain, and this focuses very heavily on the Zoological Society of London. So, in 1881, an unnamed individual contacted the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals to inform its secretary of an atrocity he had witnessed at London Zoo. According to the letter, the man had visited the zoo the previous Friday and been ushered into the reptile house during feeding time. Before he knew what was happening, he found himself in front of one of the snakes' cages, where he saw small animals, mice, sparrows, rabbits, guinea pigs, etc., being placed alive inside the tank and subjected to what he described as a period of torture before they were devoured. He then moved on to observe the pythons, watching in horror as two of the animals crushed white ducks between their coils, the feet and heads of the latter giving occasional signs of life in jerks and movements of the beaks. So disgusted was the witness that he immediately reported the matter to the RSPCA. I should be failing in my duty as a member of a Christian community if I did not bring what passed before my eyes to the attention of the powerful and ubiquitous society, which is the constituted guardian of the animal creation in this country. The anonymous letter sent to the RSPCA was just one of many letters received and later published by the Society concerning the practice of feeding snakes with live prey in zoological institutions. Though not a new phenomenon, live feeding drew increasing criticism from the 1870s and became a matter of deep concern for animal welfare societies. It occupied a disproportionate space in the journals of animal protection organisations like the Humanitarian League, and posed complex questions about the morality and biological necessity of feeding snakes with live birds and rodents. As the anonymous critic meditated, are full-grown ducks, with their strong claws and bills, proper food for snakes? Would they prey on such in their natural state? Will large snakes exist on nothing but live prey? If so, is it not a grave crime to keep these creatures in existence at the price of such nameless torture? Focusing then on the period 1876 to 1914, when the snake feeding controversy reached its zenith, this talk charts changing attitudes towards the treatment of reptiles in captivity, and it asks why an apparently niche practice generated so much interest. Compared to other, more well-documented animal abuses, such as vivisection, animal baiting, or the slaughter of wild animals for fashion, live feeding has received little attention from scholars. For 19th century animal protectionists, however, live feeding became something of a fixation, and its surprising prominence in animal protection literature raises important questions about conceptions of pain, notions of public decency, and the ethics of keeping snakes in captivity. By looking at the arguments put forward for and against live feeding over an extended period, the paper traces the changing nature of humanitarian activism in the late 19th century and shows how the shifting character of the live feeding debate paralleled wider trends in the animal welfare movement. I focus here on two pivotal moments in the snake feeding saga, each of which generated extensive coverage in the press, and each of which focused on London Zoo. The 1880s, when the RSPCA campaigned to end the public feeding of snakes with live prey at London Zoo, and the period from about 1902 to 1911, when the Humanitarian League conducted a sustained campaign against live feeding at the same zoo, but by this point the feeding was taking place in private, not in public. So, snake feeding, of course, is a rather unusual topic and not a particularly cheerful one. Despite initial appearances, though, I argue that it does have wider relevance to zoo historians and to historians of natural history as well. And hopefully it touches on several issues that continue to shape human interactions with zoo animals, and of course with animals more broadly. So I want to just briefly lay some of these out before I get into the specific detail of the topic. So first then, while snakes had some very particular dietary requirements, animal nutrition is of course a central part of zookeeping, and it features prominently in zoo guides and account books. On the one hand, finding the correct food for animals to eat in captivity was a major challenge for zoos, causing keepers headaches and leading, in many cases, to truncated animal lives. So just to give some more perhaps extreme examples, the first tamandua anteater exhibited at London Zoo subsisted on milk in which sweet biscuits had been pulped down and a portion of meat minced in a sausage machine. An orangutan exhibited at the Jardin des Plantes in Paris in 1848 reportedly consumed chocolate, roast meat, wine and even liqueurs, while London Zoo director Abraham D. Bartlett purchased a few bunches of parsnips for a sick Amazonian manatee in 1897 in a last effort to revive its appetite. This failed and unfortunately it died. On the other hand, the public's desire to see wild animals being fed, and often, as in these images, to actively feed them, shaped human-animal interactions at the zoo, providing an often rare glimpse of animal activity and giving a welcome boost to zoo finances. It also, though, often shortened animal lives through overfeeding or feeding animals on the wrong thing. And you can see that there's a very clear sign saying don't feed the giraffe, but, well, the giraffe is breaking the rules. One rather tragic example of this is Roland, who was a popular sea elephant at Berlin Zoological Gardens in 1935, where he sadly died from what was described as injudicious feeding, his keeper having often found beer bottles, glasses and cigarette boxes in his tank, so definitely injudicious. Snake feeding, as we'll see, was a significant draw for zoo goers, and it posed similar questions about diet and welfare. Where it differed from, for instance, feeding buns to the bears or gingerbread to the elephants, however, was in that these questions about welfare extended to the food, as well as, or indeed rather instead of, the animals on exhibit, reminding us that zoo animals, or at least carnivores, survive by eating other animals. And when those animals are in captivity, their prey must be provided by humans. Now, mostly this is pre-killed, but occasionally it might still be alive, and this clearly poses difficult questions about the relative rights of different species. Second, the snake feeding debate raised issues of authority and expertise, which are obviously common to the study of natural history. In attempting to decide whether snakes needed to be fed on live prey, and whether the process was unnecessarily cruel, contemporaries debated two key questions related to the physiology and cognition of the animal actors involved. And these were: one, could snakes digest dead prey? And two, and this becomes more significant later in the century, did the prey animals experience fear before their consumption, and how should that be determined? Different people addressed these questions in different ways and came up with different answers. Supporters of live feeding argued that snakes would only eat prey if it was still alive. And they also suggested that only humans and primates were instinctively scared of snakes. Opponents, though, insisted that this claim was wrong. Here, I explore some of these different forms of evidence, and I think about how animal welfare charities, zoo directors, and to an extent zookeepers as well, use different types of authority to bolster their argument. So was first-hand experience of caring for animals more trustworthy than, say, theoretical knowledge? To what extent did class, gender and professional qualifications affect the credibility of witnesses? And importantly, what kind of rhetorical devices did actors use to render their claims believable? Third, and finally, the snake feeding controversy highlights the importance of visibility in 19th century perceptions of cruelty, and arguably modern ones as well. So in the 1880s, opponents of live feeding complained that the public nature of the practice would encourage voyeurism and it would brutalise spectators. In the early 1900s, however, after snake feeding had been moved behind closed doors, members of the Humanitarian League worried, conversely, that the private performance might permit even greater cruelty because no one was there to witness it and monitor it. In light of these concerns, I consider how seeing or hiding violence towards animals shaped public responses to suffering, noting important parallels between snake feeding, vivisection, and the slaughter of animals for meat, all of which shifted from public spectacle to private practice during the same period. And of course, the question of visibility remains central to the management of zoos, both past and present, as keepers have to decide whether to exhibit or conceal the more uncomfortable or offensive aspects of animal husbandry and life cycles. So that might include things like violent handling of animals. You can see a giraffe there being tamed and broken in. You can see also some force feeding of a young penguin. Or it might be other things like animals fighting, or animals mating or pacing, or displaying kind of visible signs of sickness or injury. So should apparent animal suffering be hidden from view? And if so, who or what is being protected by doing that? Is it the animal itself, or is it just the sensitivities of the prospective viewer? And of course, potentially the reputation of the zoo. So all of these things factor into the snake feeding controversy. So then, without further ado, on with the story. So the snake feeding debate kicked off in 1876, when the RSPCA became aware that the inhabitants of the reptile house were being fed on live prey in front of the watching public every Friday afternoon. The opening salvos of the controversy had in fact been fired 7 years earlier, in 1869, when James Edmonds, the owner of a travelling menagerie, was hauled before court in Liverpool for feeding a live rat to a snake in his show. And he actually was exonerated for this on technical grounds because rabbits weren't covered by the animal protection law at the time. Now, though, with London Zoo in the firing line, the volume of the debate ramped up considerably, putting the rights and wrongs of live feeding under the microscope. Beginning in private, with an exchange of letters between Philip Lutley Sclatter, Secretary of the Zoological Society, and John Colham, Secretary of the RSPCA, the discussion later entered the public sphere, appearing in the press and culminating in a series of lengthy articles in the RSPCA's monthly magazine, The Animal World, in the spring and summer of 1881. Criticism of live feeding focused on three key aspects of the process: the suffering of the prey animals, the inappropriateness of conducting the feeding in public, and the unacceptability of feeding warm-blooded mammals and birds to cold-blooded and supposedly inferior pythons and boa constrictors. So the RSPCA made its first moves against the zoo in 1876, when Colham opened his correspondence with Sclatter. The RSPCA's secretary had heard that live feeding was going on in the reptile house and appealed to his counterpart at the ZSL to put a stop to it, partly on welfare grounds and partly on grounds of public decency. This appeal was met with frosty defiance from Sclatter, who responded with 5 statements in defence of the practice, which you can see up here. So these were, 1, that there's no cruelty in the practice conducted under his direction in the reptile house every week during feeding time. 2, there is no attempt made by the management to attract persons to the gardens by advertising the feeding time in the reptile house and by making such occasions sensational as shows. And this was very much them trying to differentiate themselves from travelling menageries and circuses. 3, the serpents living in the reptile house cannot be kept in health unless living prey be given to them. 4, it is necessary for educational and scientific purposes to preserve ophidians or snakes in menageries. And 5, this spectacle of serpent feeding in the reptile house isn't repulsive and demoralising, but it's a reasonable and desirable source of healthy amusement to children and young persons, which is perhaps his most controversial claim. The RSPCA, though, wasn't convinced by any of this, and to prove this wrong, they gathered together lots of evidence and claims from various people who'd visited the zoo, effectively to prove that it was cruel and that it wasn't necessary. So addressing, to begin with then, Sclatter's claim that feeding snakes with live prey wasn't cruel, the RSPCA retaliated with a barrage of empirical accounts relating behaviours indicative of pain and distress. So one observer described how he saw 3 snakes simultaneously attack a live frog, which was screaming with all its might, before one of the serpents swallowed it alive. And another related the fate of a young guinea pig, which was struck by a puff adder on the left cheek and squeaked around the cage, pawing the part with its hind foot. All of these extracts, and there were 37 in total, which made rather grim reading, emphasised the pain and fear suffered by the creatures placed in the reptile's cage, providing a grimly monotonous recitation of cruelty. Within that, a recurring element in the accounts published by the RSPCA was the protracted nature of the killing. And this was viewed as tantamount to torture, and that's a word that was explicitly used by a lot of these commentators. Because there was a sort of sense that snakes were kind of playing with their prey, not finishing it off as quickly as they could. So one example of this comes from an account about a guinea pig, which an observer recorded with quite scientific precision. So he claimed that the animal was basically struggling in the snake's cage for over 20 minutes. I saw one snake fix a guinea pig with its body, holding the guinea pig in a vice. This occurred at 6:10 p.m, and the cries of the poor guinea pig were simply sickening. The guinea pig continued squeaking till 6:22, 12 minutes by my watch, until it was utterly exhausted in its endeavours to free itself from its tormentor. So this kind of drawn-out character of the suffering elicited inevitable comparisons with the other hot topic of the day, which was vivisection, and some people made a direct comparison. So one writer remarked that slaughterhouse torture is brief and tolerable compared to snake feeding, which is as repugnant as vivisection. So having established that live feeding was indeed cruel, the RSPCA went on to tackle Satter's third point, that the practice was necessary. Writing in the Times, Slatter had insisted that snakes, according to the long experience of those who keep them in captivity, will not, in the majority of cases, feed at all except upon living food. The RSPCA, however, disputed this claim, citing several instances in which snakes had been seen to consume freshly killed prey, without any apparent ill effects. So on one occasion, a spectator reported that some of the animals given for food were apparently half killed just before they were put in, such as sparrows, mice, etc., being able to move just for upwards of 2 or 3 minutes, and then they died and were generally eaten. Another witness stated that a keeper separated an anaconda from the live rabbit that it was struggling to ingest, killed the rabbit and gave it to the reptile, which took it and soon commenced to eat it. So in both these cases then, the witnesses questioned the keepers about what they were doing, but they received quite evasive responses. So the first man was told that snakes prefer live animals, but as they have a tank of water in their cages, their prey might get into the water and drown themselves, if not nipped a bit before being put in, and then the serpents wouldn't eat them. The second, anxious to know whether this was to be the inauguration of a new plan in feeding, tried to elicit information from the keeper, but was informed that I cannot give you any information, and after further prompting that we follow God's laws and ordinances and they must be right. Snakes thus clearly did eat dead prey on occasion, but the practice of pre-killing their food was only adopted in specific circumstances. If the evidence for the necessity of live feeding was inconclusive, another aspect of the feeding process was indisputably repulsive, namely the fact that it took place in full public view. In a conversation with John Colum, Slatter had insisted that they didn't try to advertise snake feeding in any way. But whether it was advertised or not, there wasn't anything stopping people from seeing it. And according to one account, you had only to knock on the door of the reptile house on a Friday afternoon and you'd be admitted. One visitor stated that there were 116 present during one feeding session, and what really bothered him was that this included 20 children. Another counted 59 men and 47 women, accompanied by 27 male and female children. While some of those present reacted with disgust to what they saw, fainting, voicing objections or averting their eyes, many others appeared to revel in the action, even cheering on the snakes as they cornered their prey. One witness reported that he heard shouts of enjoyment and offers to wager on certain snakes killing or seizing prey within a certain time. And from these people, I heard what I may call a murmur of applause when any snake made a clever seizure. Such unseemly behaviour raised concerns of moral corruption, particularly in relation to children. So as another horrified observer reflected, could one wonder if these children should afterwards be found pulling off flies' legs, stoning frogs, or leaving callow birds to die which they had intended to feed, eventually growing up with a craving for cockfighting and to be present at a hanging? Far from being a reasonable and healthy source of amusement for children then, the live feeding of snakes had the potential to brutalise younger viewers and to inure them to other forms of violence, or at least that's what humanitarians feared. Two further aspects of live feeding generated particular concern, and I think they could help us to understand why the practice was so reviled. So first was the fact that the snake's prey couldn't escape. So most Victorians accepted the inevitability of prey species succumbing to their predators. However, stacking the deck so shamelessly in favour of the predator violated the sense of fair play which was dear to a lot of Victorian big game hunters. And for this reason, it was seen as both unnatural and cruel. So watching one feeding episode, for example, an observer condemned what he saw as the unequal nature of the contest and specifically denounced the human contrivances that tilted it in the snake's favour. So as he put it, if the snakes had been at large on the banks of the Regent's Park Canal and the ducks had been attacked by them there, I should have had no feelings of distress. Here, however, by the hand of man, were 4 helpless ducks, placed without any loophole or escape. The flying, the swimming, the diving, which might have helped them if attacked in their own element, availed them nothing now. So effectively the constraints put on the prey animals denied them of any kind of agency, any ability to run away, and that was what made the whole contest unfair. The second aspect of snake feeding that provoked outrage was, I think, its perceived subversion of zoological hierarchies. So described variously as tormentors, horrid creatures, and cruel monsters, snakes had a bad reputation and were widely viewed as more primitive life forms than the warm-blooded rabbits, guinea pigs, and pigeons that they ingested. Several commentators duly suggested that the zoo should dispense with snakes altogether if they couldn't improve their grisly table manners, placing their right to life below that of their mammalian prey. So one critic remarked that if the serpents cannot live on food already dead, then a stuffed snake would provide as good an illustration of its kind as our duty and principles of humanity ought to allow us to show. A second, comparing the zoo's reptiles with the recently departed African elephant Jumbo, you can see here. Incidentally, Jumbo's sailors actually financed the building of the reptile house, which was a bit controversial in 1883. So he insisted that the presence in the gardens of so noble, so grand, so eminently sagacious a being as Jumbo is of far more importance to the instruction and edification of numerous spectators than can be any number of boa constrictors and other useless and horrifying monsters of the serpent species, which, moreover, are, Horesco friends, fed with living beings far higher in organisation than themselves. And it's noteworthy here that Jumbo's being fed on a bun, which was a sort of more benign form of food. That the perceived low status of snakes was central to the opposition of live feeding is further reinforced by the contrasting perception of 2 other species which also engaged in predatory behaviour at London Zoo, Sally the chimpanzee and the institution's seals. Sally, a popular favourite at the zoo between 1883 and 1891, reportedly had a penchant for catching her own dinner. If a small bird were let fly in her cage, she would adroitly catch it as it flew past her, bite off the head and eat its skin and feathers included. She even reportedly subsisted on young pigeons for several months, before adopting what was described as the more civilised diet of cooked mutton and beef tea. Despite her carnivorous tendencies, however, nobody criticised Sally's feeding habits or suggested that a stuffed chimpanzee would suffice in her place. This was undoubtedly because Sally was a primate, closely related to humans, and clearly above her avian prey in the zoological pecking order. As for the seals, contemporary accounts suggest that they, too, sometimes subsisted on a diet of live fish, as apparently did some pelicans and storks. But again, the practice of live feeding appears to have been relatively uncontroversial among the public, attracting none of the outrage levelled at snakes. So one lone critic, the ornithologist Francis Orpen Morris, wrote to the RSPCA in 1871 to question the necessity of feeding the seals with live fish, especially as they have to be put down their throats one by one. But his complaint generated little interest and received no reply. So feeding live fish to seals was therefore apparently acceptable in a way that feeding live birds and rabbits to snakes was not. So we'll move on to the second part of our story then. So the public feeding of snakes at London Zoo came to an end in 1883 in response to pressure from the RSPCA. Live feeding, though, persisted, now behind closed doors, and this precipitated a second phase of the debate, in which humanitarians lobbied to end the practice completely. The main protagonists in this renewed controversy were the Humanitarian League, founded by Henry Salt, you can see there, and the new director of the Zoological Society, Peter Chalmers Mitchell, who succeeded Slatter in 1903. As in the 1880s, the debate took place through the medium of private correspondence, emotive articles, and letters in the press, though the tone of discussions was more acrimonious, as we'll hear, and relationships between the protagonists a lot chillier. And this reflected the more radical character of the Humanitarian League, which, unlike the moderate RSPCA, promoted vegetarianism, opposed vivisection and hunting for sport, and campaigned vociferously against corporal and capital punishment, and also for female suffrage. So the issue of live feeding came to public attention once more in September 1902, when T.W. Hitchmow visited London Zoo. Hitchmow wandered past the reptile house, where he spotted a big box with a wire on top, full of live rats, and a series of rabbit hutches. He then heard a plaintive cry as a small goat of friendly disposition came running up to the wire fence of its enclosure, eager to be petted. While Hitchmow was busy scratching the little fellow's head, a keeper passed by, and Hitchmow asked him, "What are these chaps kept here for?" The keeper proceeded to tell him that the big python gets them, that he killed them himself, and that it wasn't a quick death, for the python hasn't much room to move about, so perhaps he only gets one coil round, and that grip forces out the entrails and breaks the goat's ribs. This statement, unsurprisingly, shocked Hitchmow, who, after steadying his nerves with a drop of brandy, addressed a strongly worded letter to the Freelance magazine, calling for readers to help stop what seems to me to be wanton cruelty in the zoological gardens. Hitchmow's cause was swiftly taken up by the Humanitarian League, which published his letter in its journal and contacted the Duke of Bedford, president of the ZSL, for comment. The Duke declined to reply for 3 months, but the League eventually elicited the ambiguous response that the use of living animals as food for the inmates of the Society's reptile house is confined to cases in which such diet is necessary, and in these cases, all care is taken to avoid any unnecessary suffering. Taking this as an admission that live feeding did occur, Salt pushed to have it banned, or at least regulated, and he suggested that an RSPCA officer should be stationed in the cage to ensure there wasn't any sort of gratuitous cruelty. In June 1903, Chalmers Mitchell announced that live feeding had ended, and that in future the reptiles will, as far as possible, and that was the key phrase, be fed on freshly killed rabbits and pigeons. 3 years later, though, the issue surfaced again when a report appeared in the Tribune alleging that on a recent occasion a live goat was given to the python. Angry at the apparent resumption of live feeding, and suspicious that the practice had never really stopped, the Humanitarian League fired off another series of letters to the ZSL, this time targeting Chalmers Mitchell, and the latter's evasive reply convinced Salt that the rumours were true. In June 1907, still dissatisfied with the ZSL's so-called official secrecy, the League persuaded MP George Greenwood to raise the issue in Parliament, where he received a reply from the Home Secretary, no less, that live prey is never given to serpents when they will accept dead prey. This was followed by a hostile meeting at the ZSL in January 1908, in which Roland Hunt and Captain Alfred Carpenter expressed their objections to live feeding and were met with sneers of derision. In March, reports circulated in the press that live feeding had ended, whereupon Greenwood wrote to Chalmers Mitchell to confirm that this was true. The latter's angry silence was interpreted by the Humanitarian League as evidence that some snakes were still receiving live prey, probably the venomous ones. The snake feeding controversy only receded in 1911, when the ZSL recommenced feeding its reptiles in public every Friday afternoon, but this time giving them dead prey to prove they weren't given live prey, so kind of doubling back on itself. So the second instalment of the snake feeding debate reprised a lot of the themes from the 1880s, but it also introduced some new elements, which we'll look at now. So one stark difference between snake feeding in 1903 and snake feeding in 1881 was that the former, as I've said, occurred in private. Rather than diminishing the cruelty, however, this increased it in the eyes of the Humanitarian League, which feared that greater brutality might be inflicted on the snake's living prey now there was no one there to watch it. So writing in 1909, for example, one critic wrote, "So long as the throwing of the victims into the cages of the serpents and other reptiles was done publicly, there was some possibility that the fear of exposure might have some influence to deter aggravation or callousness on the part of the keepers. Secrecy, irresponsibility, and immunity from public censure all the world over leave the doors open to the widest extent for every degree and form of callousness and cruelty." And it's worth noting that this kind of emphasis on hidden cruelty correlated really closely with the other concern of the Humanitarian League. So the big one here was vivisection, and the fear again was that often animals, particularly pet dogs and cats, were being taken off the street, were being experimented on them in kind of hidden laboratories. The other debate that was going on at this time, and again becoming increasingly loud, was concern about performing animals and circus animals. And once more, the fear here is that the animal looks okay in public. It might seem to lick its trainer's hand on the stage or to be closely connected with them. But in order to achieve that, the animal was being abused in private. And there were quite a few more sort of scandalous cases about dancing bears in particular being beaten up in theatres during rehearsals, and particularly the famous chimpanzee Consul. There are some quite grim stories about him. So the Humanitarian League was very much, I think, drawing on these when it was focusing on the snake feeding controversy. The second instalment of the snake feeding debate reprised a lot of the... a second aspect of the renewed snake-feeding debate was the old question of whether the methods used in the zoological gardens were natural and necessary, with the emphasis now increasingly on natural. So for humanitarians, the essentially unnatural conditions imposed by captivity distorted the behaviour of the snakes so much that they were unable to dispatch their prey quickly, increasing the cruelty. Rather than continuing to sacrifice innocent goats to sickly reptiles, therefore, it would make more sense to exhibit the latter dead in poses that accurately resembled how they behaved in the wild. So one person who thought this quite strongly was Admiral Kennedy, and he wrote in 1911 that the answer to those who claim that snakes must be fed on live things is simple. Give them dead meat, and if they will not eat it, but they will rather than starve, kill the snakes. They would look just as well stuffed, as they are usually called up in a torpid state of no more interest than a coil of rope. So he wasn't really a fan of snakes. However, for those who liked snakes and wanted to see living specimens, such a remedy wasn't really acceptable. So Edmund Selous, who was a renowned ornithologist and elsewhere actually a fierce critic of zoological gardens, dissented from the Humanitarian League on this matter, on the grounds that there is no sense, in my opinion, in keeping snakes except to study their habits. And those habits in their entirety I claim a right to study. Writing in 1909, meanwhile, after the Regent's Park, the shift to dead prey, reptile owner Mary Cadogan complained that both reticulated pythons in the Regent's Park Zoo had expired, victims, she surmised, of what she called the absurd fiat that has gone forth consequent on the agitation against feeding reptiles with live animals. This view was seconded by naturalist Frederick Aflalo, who questioned whether the death of the big pythons is wholly due to the cold, or whether inadequate methods of feeding, regrettably forced on the authorities by public opinion, which knows better than God how reptiles should take their food, have also had their share in the abnormal death toll. As Aflalo's reference to God suggests, this debate sometimes took on a religious tone, especially when participants weighed up the moral implications of supplying snakes with live prey. So defenders of live feeding argued that it was God's will that snakes eat their prey alive, and therefore man's duty to facilitate that. So one writer, using the quite interesting pseudonym Anaconda, sent a telegram to the ZSL in 1908, urging them to stand firm for live feeding and maintain the ordinances of the Creator. A second, the aforementioned Mary Cadogan, complained that the Zoological Society was being, as she put it, ruled by a panel of old women who set themselves up as knowing better than the good God, creator of all, who allotted to each its appointed food. Humanitarians, by contrast, believed that man's duty was to the goats, rabbits and guinea pigs fed alive to reptiles, contending that actively providing snakes with living victims was going well beyond God's will. And most insistent on this point was Stephen Coleridge, who was president of National Anti-Vivisection Society, and he likened giving live goats to pythons to providing victims to Britain's most famous serial killer. So as he wrote, the great mastermind ordained that Lord Shaftesbury and Jack the Ripper, the alligator and Mr. H. Owen, who was a supporter of live feeding. But for myself, I do not think the great mastermind intended me to assist Jack the Ripper to his victims, the alligator to his human prey, nor the python to his live goat. So God might have decreed that snakes should subsist on live prey, but he certainly hadn't decreed that man should supply them with that. Finally, as happened in 1881, the issue of expertise undergirded the entire debate, with contributors on both sides asserting their right to enter the discussion. So Chalmers Mitchell based his defence of occasional live feeding on what he believed to be biological evidence, citing a scientific memoir published in the Proceedings of the Zoological Society as proof that only men and monkeys have an instinctive fear of snakes. Hence, rabbits, guinea pigs and goats could be fed to the latter without suffering psychological torture. Salt, conversely, cited the experience of two foreign zoological professionals, Bronx Zoo director William Hornaday and Hamburg animal dealer Karl Hagenbeck, to prove that the feeding of dead prey was both viable and desirable. A 1903 article in the New York Times, for example, described how the snakes under Hornaday's care dined on freshly killed rats, chickens and frogs, and this was actually in part to protect the snakes from being injured by their live prey. Though it did admit that 27-foot python called Tsarina, you can see here, had to be force-fed once a fortnight by keepers to get her to accept the inanimate prey. So effectively this compromised the welfare of snakes. Perhaps inspired by these theoretical discussions, keepers at Bellevue Zoo in Manchester conducted their own experiment on mammalian fear of snakes, introducing what they described as a rather unnaturally posed stuffed cobra, and then a lively boa constrictor into the monkey's cage and observing the primate's reactions. According to notes in a handwritten journal, the spider monkeys eyed the fake snake with mild wonder, nothing more, while an old rhesus monkey thought of touching the live snake, but dare not, and all this time his hands dithered with excitement, and he bared his teeth, and was around and in the wires above the reptile, until we feared for the snake, which we removed. Zoologists, humanitarians and zookeepers thus made their own distinctive interventions into the feeding debate, drawing upon empirical observation to assess the necessity and welfare implications of feeding snakes with live prey. One final and particularly interesting element of this long-standing tussle was the conflict between science and literature, which broadly mapped onto the battle between men of science and animal protectionists. So countering Chalmers Mitchell's supposedly scientific assertion that only men and monkeys were instinctively scared of snakes, Salt referred to the ZSL's secretary to a letter from Charles Dickens, in which a vivid description is given of the guinea pig backing against the side of the cage, and of the 5 small sparrows shaking together like dry leaves when the serpent approached them, so that they were scared. Chalmers Mitchell, however, refused to accept what he called some purple passages from the writings of Charles Dickens as evidence that small animals experience fear in the presence of snakes, insinuating that science trumped literature when it came to interpreting animal behaviour. While Chalmers Mitchell was unmoved by literary exposition, others embraced the written word, using poetry as a vehicle for changing public opinion. So one animal lover penned a poem entitled The Hymn of the Pious Reptile Keeper, which described, from a fictitious keeper's perspective, how down pythons' throats we thrust live goats, their natural food, oh rather. Another parodied Chalmers Mitchell's claim that non-primates had no innate fear of snakes, and it did that by describing the supposed indifference of one so-called happy guinea pig to be placed in a cage with a python. This poem is rather charming, so it went, "So if you chance to see us, friend, with shivering limbs and hair on end, and all the signs of mortal fright, know that we tremble with delight, and that our highest bliss is when we're thrust alive in Python's den." A rather less happy poem than the one about Timothy the tortoise. So literature was thus pitted against science in a public battle for hearts and minds, a move that foreshadowed many subsequent animal welfare campaigns. So then, to bring this to a close, the struggle over live feeding in British menageries was a protracted conflict that surfaced on several occasions between 1869 and 1914. On the face of it, it was a very strange issue to attract so much attention. Snake feeding, however repulsive, was clearly a very niche concern, and it paled into insignificance in comparison with many other abuses. Despite its limited extent, however, live feeding generated a disproportionate amount of press coverage, and it preoccupied animal welfare campaigners for half a century. So why did the practice elicit so much opposition? What other concerns did it speak to? And what can the debate surrounding it tell us about changing attitudes towards animals? Well, first, I think the evolving nature of the debate highlighted wider social anxieties and was connected to broader questions about the visibility of suffering. So in the mid-19th century, there was a lot of concern about the corrupting influence of witnessing violence, and moves to kind of make that violence increasingly less visible. Hence, vivisection was removed from the public sphere, slaughterhouses were exiled to the suburbs, and executions were moved behind prison gates. By the early 20th century, however, the primary concern was hidden cruelty, and there was fear that rendering cruelty invisible would mean it wasn't subject to proper regulation. The changing feeding practices of snakes perfectly paralleled these developments, functioning, I think, as a proxy for deeper and maybe more contentious social issues. And it's probably for this reason that what appears to be a very rare form of cruelty became something of an obsession, particularly for the Humanitarian League. Within the scientific context of the zoo, moreover, the snake feeding debate reflected a growing concern with the treatment of captive animals and increased sensitivity to the perceived suffering of inmates, which was often made visible around 1900 through lurid exposés and later emotive photographs. So Edmund Selous, for example, wrote a searing critique of Bristol Zoo in 1902, comparing the monkey house to a coffin and describing a host of sickly animals. And he mentioned rickety lion cubs, a Diana monkey with a missing tail, and a lemur that was blind in one eye. The photographer Robert Gambier Bolton made equally damning claims about London Zoo in 1903, reporting that most bears were suffering from cataracts, which he says was caused by insanitary and cramped accommodation, while the monkey house was what he described as a hotbed of tuberculosis. And he corroborated these allegations with some evocative images, including this one, which we can see of a polar bear. So what people saw at the zoo and how they interpreted it thus became the basis for critical commentaries on zoological institutions, which were often further amplified in the press. And this, in turn, forced zoo personnel to reflect more deeply on the visibility of certain practices and to reconsider what the public should and perhaps shouldn't be permitted to see during their visits, and that remains an issue today. Third, the snake feeding controversy offers an insight into the rival forms of expertise surrounding animal management in the 19th century and the types of evidence used to support different feeding practices. Keepers and zoo directors emphasised their personal experience of snakes based on years of close contact. Humanitarians, conversely, drew upon eyewitness accounts from members of the public and consulted practitioners at other zoos. As the debate progressed, it also assumed an international dimension, as actors on both sides summoned evidence of practice overseas to support their respective stances. The RSPCA, for example, noted that live feeding had been abandoned at the Parisian Jardin des Plantes in 1874. 2 decades later, British delegates attending the 1907 Zoological Congress in Boston visited Raymond Ditmars and Charles Snyder at the Bronx Zoo and quizzed them about their feeding methods, which by this time involved pre-killing snakes' prey. Knowledge was essential to discussion about snake diets, though participants disagreed as to what kind of knowledge carried the most weight. Finally, the snake feeding debate highlights the existence of human-imposed hierarchies on the animal world and their importance in determining the treatment of non-human species. So feeding live fish to a seal was comparatively unproblematic because the predator was viewed as superior to the prey. Feeding live mammals to snakes, however, was repugnant because it inverted these supposedly natural hierarchies. These views reflected broader assumptions about the cognitive capabilities of animals, with higher mammals often deemed the most capable of experiencing pain, and reptiles, amphibians, and fish ascribed a lower degree of sensitivity. Though 20th century science has shifted the boundaries of these hierarchies, such assumptions continue to shape our attitudes towards other species and to influence debates about animal rights. They also, interestingly, continue to shape feeding practices in zoos, where the feeding of live vertebrates and cephalopod prey is now illegal in Britain, but the live feeding of invertebrates is still permitted. The preoccupations of 19th century humanitarians thus illuminate wider questions about our understanding of other species that remain pertinent to this day. Thanks very much for listening.